Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the SERMAPod. This is the podcast of the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I am the founder and CEO of SERMA, also the host of the podcast, Rich Lenkov. We're very privileged to have a guest today, Jay Taylor, who is a shareholder at Anderson Kill. He is chair of the Corporate and Finance Practice Group and is talking today about exploring various funding methods for film and TV projects, something that is very near and dear to many of our members' hearts. So it's a really timely and interesting topic. Jay, thanks so much and welcome to the SERMAPod.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the time to come talk to your audience.
Of course. So a lot of our attorneys and others who are in SERMA work directly with film productions. And we know that funding these projects is very capital intensive. There are perhaps more ways than ever these days to fund these projects. So in many ways, it's good news. We don't have to be beholden to the old studio system like back in the day. That being said, there's lots of pitfalls and areas of concern when you are raising capital. Talk to us generally about the concept before we dive into some specifics.
Okay, sure. Let me give you a little background. And kind of a little summary before we launch into the specific methods. Of course, your audience knows that filmmaking, effective filmmaking, requires good finances, right? Also requires a good star and a good production and quality, but it requires good pre-production and production process. Just a little bit about the history, which I find interesting, is that early cinema financing was done almost exclusively by studios, right? Studios had significant control over the distribution of films, what films were financed and how they were distributed until the Paramount Decree is what was known as the Paramount Decree. So in the U.S., the Paramount Pictures was in 1948. Landmark case where it was an antitrust case and studios could no longer own all of the elements of distribution. They can't own the movie theaters. They couldn't own everything. So that is really the genesis of the finance process, where the financing started to develop because it was more decentralized. So there was an opportunity and a desire to find various sources. And of course, over the years, financing techniques in the film industry in general have developed. So for film finance, it involves, of course, raising capital, securing loans, and attracting investors to a project. There are different ways to attract investors to a project. Of course, you can have a great star. We've all seen films with great stars that were bad scripts. You can have a good producer or director. And of course, a lot of times when a good director attaches him or herself to a project, it makes it easier to raise capital. Folks don't always have that option these days because there are a myriad of projects and there are all sorts of different platforms where films and television shows are being placed. So there are a lot more options and there are a lot more artists, I believe, today as well as compared to earlier times. So the movie financing process really takes place in three phases. Of course, there's pre-production, there's production, and there's post-production. Each has its mix of financing technique that's important or key to each area. So, for instance, the pre-production, you have your filmmakers they purchase the scripts, they cast actors, they scout locations, and they plan logistics of the shoot. These are generally less capital-intensive portions because you're not necessarily paying, actor salaries. You don't have huge budgets for the pre-production phase. The production phase is the phase where you're going to have more of your expenses, right? And post-production involves the editing and the sound design and visual effects. And actually that takes up quite a few resources as well, particularly for today's films. Sometimes they're heavy in technology. There might be heavy CGI budgets or things like that. So these are the different phases where the money actually gets spent. Now let's talk about some of the possibilities of financing. Right. First, there's studio financing. There's still studio financing. This is, of course, one of the largest forms of financing currently. Studio financing is, like major studios like Warner Brothers, Universal, Disney. I mean, they have extensive resources, and in return, they typically want to retain significant control of your process, artistic control, financial control. And that can really impact the creativity of what you're doing. Sometimes studios will partner, with each other, and they will partner to create a major production. Studios also use various forms of financing. They will finance a portion of a project sometimes, and they will outsource or look for additional financing techniques. And it really depends on their faith in the project and where they see the creative control and how much creative control they feel they may have to give up. Of course, you want to minimize your risk, right? If they have strong actors and a strong producer, strong director, then of course, naturally, a studio is going to want to retain more control over that project, at least over the budgets, right? The strength of the director and the producer, they also serve to, on the other end, loosen some of that control because of the record of success. But, one great advantage of studio financing is that you have a significant and substantial source of capital, right, for your projects. So it's more likely to be a successful project. But again, they take a large share of profits and leave less for creatives and everyone else. And that can be a problem for some. Then outside of the studios, there are independent financing options. And independent financing involves raising funds from independent sources, private investors, production companies, or other entities outside of the major studios. It's especially popular among creatives who want to retain control, right? Because they are looking for investors who share their vision in the project. And sometimes you find these investors in, let's say, the various film festivals. You showcase your film, and you may search for particular investors that are going to help you with distribution of your film if they like your film. They may attach to future projects. But the independent film arena has become a huge source of interest because there are a lot of projects that are not great, but the projects that do hit, there are a lot of independent films that are great these days. And when you do have a great independent film, you can invest in 15 horrible independent films. But if you get that one great independent film, which often happens, and it's happening more often these days, then you have a greater opportunity of success. And so, and there are various ways that the indie market finances films.
So Jay, that's all really interesting. I want to pick up though on something you said because you mentioned risk.
Sure.
Risk is
yes.
as an organization, right? And we're in the job
Absolutely.
of trying to discuss how to mitigate that risk. So, what are some of the types of risks that you might mitigate if you go with a studio production or financing versus doing it independently? Because obviously that's one of the advantages to having a big studio behind you, right? What are some of the risks that you might avoid if you're going through the traditional method of financing through a studio?
Absolutely. There is always an exchange, right? So the less risk you have, the less profitability you will likely have, right? So there is an inverse relationship between that. The studios will pick up the risk of payment. They'll pick up the risk of failure, right? So the major risk is a repayment risk and a risk the project will fail, right? So if you're an independent film producer, you take on the risk because let's say you're an indie film producer and you have some combination of equity financing and debt financing, right? The debt financing may be personally guaranteed in some instances, and so you have more risk in the project, but you also have a greater reward. When you have a studio, the studio is willing to absorb most of that risk. So you're actually reducing the risk, but in reducing the risk, you're actually reducing creative control, and you're reducing your ability to profit. So it's risk of repayment. Again, the risk that the project may not be successful. And then there are various other risks that the studio is able to absorb, like tax risks, which they may mitigate by, doing the project in a jurisdiction where there are certain tax incentives, right? So you can reduce your tax risk there. And there are other risks, smaller risks that you can get absorbed by the studio.
Right. So there's some give and take there, share some risk, but give up perhaps some creative control. I want to just also ask you quickly about film financing in terms of, I think many of our listeners and viewers understand some of the costs involved in production, things like, as you mentioned, paying, for talent, paying for, certain physical amenities and so forth. But, one of the things that we've talked about extensively in SERMA and in particularly at our Sundance event last year, which discussed avoiding some legal pitfalls in, dealing with your first film production or screenplay, is some of the hidden costs that you don't consider, right? I mean, when you're putting together financing or budgeting for a film, you might not realize how much insurance you need, for example, or how much, legal you should budget for. Those are things, as a filmmaker myself, in a separate part of my life, I didn't realize how much we needed until we were sued. Thankfully, we had good insurance, we had good legal, but those are things that perhaps a first-time filmmaker might not understand and might not, very importantly, budget adequately for.
Absolutely. And, one of the ways to, of course, mitigate that risk is to purchase adequate insurance. And, you hit that head on, Anderson Kill. I mean, we are one of the premier insurance firms that, we pursue carriers that, that fail to, let's say, live up to their obligations. And so we are quite familiar with mitigating risks through insurance. It's one of the hidden costs. And again, legal, you're striking a chord, because it is the gospel I preach when I speak with potential filmmakers and, anyone starting up a venture or a film or trying to, do anything in this arena, is that your legal costs are more important on the front end than on the back end, because there's always an attempt to kind of save money in the front end in general. But the key message is that legal costs incurred up front will reduce your risk significantly on the back end. I can't explain how often I've seen low cost initially result in high costs on the back end.
It's a great takeaway, not just because you and I are lawyers and we want people to hire us, but it's an incredibly important takeaway. Get it before you need it, because these days with everyone so litigious and people coming out of the woodwork and alleging IP violations, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be involved in some litigation. Let's move on, though, and talk about studio, you talk about independent. These days, another source of fundraising that we didn't see before the last 10 or so years is crowdfunding, right? That's another important source. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. Okay. So, yes, there's crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is used a lot more for independent projects. Crowdfundings were really made popular by the Jumpstart Our Jobs program, Jumpstart Our Jobs Act. And what it did was permitted an individual or a venture to raise an amount of capital. I believe it's $5 million within the year. to fund a project from a lot of smaller investors. Now, that does require some confirmation of a securities compliance in some respects, but that compliance is really done on certain platforms. So crowdfunding projects usually go through crowdfunding platforms, which does this back office confirmation, and you can purchase a small percentage in a project, which has been very helpful to get people participating in the profitability of some of these projects.
Jay, another important source, and perhaps the one we'll conclude with, is used more than ever in the really competitive world of trying to lure productions into your state, is various government grants and tax incentives. Here in Illinois, where I am, we've done some film work here, and there are very generous incentives to film here. Not as generous as some other states, but that's something that is very attractive, but does involve some pitfalls perhaps that you need to be aware of. Talk to us about that.
So yes, it's very attractive, and there's a reason that a lot of film projects are created in states like Louisiana, Georgia, like you said, Illinois is another. Michigan used to be a great forum as well. The idea is to lure the industry into the state and create jobs through tax incentives. And that is certainly very successful. One must look at, like from a risk perspective, you have to look at what you're giving up for those tax incentives. In some instances, in some states, you have to understand the right to work laws. You have to understand how you're going to employ your crew. So there are lots of things other than the tax incentive itself that a good film producer needs to look at in terms of whether or not this is the right state for me, right? So the Georgia may not be your right state, but maybe Louisiana will be the right state. And so it really depends. You have to look at a range of other factors in the financing to really make a determination as to the proper jurisdiction that's offering the incentives. Okay.
Jay Taylor from Anderson Kill, very interesting topic. Thank you so much for joining us and discussing this emerging topic. And your website is, tell us your website again, please.
Our website is andersonkill.com. That's ANDERSONKILL.com. And you can look us up, and I'm open to any conversation, any questions. You can email me personally, jtaylor, JAYTAYLOR, at andersonkill.com.
Yep. And Anderson, member Marshall Galinsky is a member of SERMA, so you can reach out to him as well. Jay, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.